So in today's video, I'm going to talk about cheating in behavioral interviews. And I'm going to touch upon the following main points. I'm going to help you to decide on whether cheating is something that you should explore at all for a job interview. I'm going to demystify on how widespread cheating is in these behavioral interviews. And I'm going to also touch upon how do people actually cheat in these behavioral interviews. And spoiler alert, yes, some people do actually cheat in these interviews, and quite successfully. Now, let's first talk about where does behavioral interviewing come from. This, simply put, this comes from, as far as I know, from investment banking businesses. So this behavioral interviewing comes from the type of businesses that require people that speak well. Bankers, investment bankers specifically, Jeff Bezos being one of them in the past, and also right now. So this is the type of environment that promotes behavioral interviewing as an efficient method for them to find the most suitable candidates. And Amazon is not the only investment banking company. In fact, most of them do behavioral interviewing as their core screening process for a job interview. So thinking at this level, so if you put at this level behavioral interviewing, and let's say you're someone applying for an AWS role, you can imagine that those people have been using behavioral interviewing not because it's easy to cheat your way through the behavioral interview, but rather, because people that are already good at speaking will supposedly have a hard time talking about, I don't know, maybe a failure or whatever else. So this is why it's important to know where behavioral interviewing comes from. Well, to know to what extent this is hackable. This is something that you can cheat your way through. This is why I believe it's super relevant. Now, what does it mean for you as a candidate to know all this? Well, it simply means that the employer is not really concerned about you cheating. It's all about you building trust with them. Behavioral interviewing is all about building trust and giving them, the behaviors that they are interested in, that they believe would be a great indicator of a successful candidate in their role. So, so long as you use a method to build trust in an interview and you use it successfully, that's something that's going to fly. They don't really care how. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, especially nowadays, when you have virtual interviews, that is digital experiences, it's slightly more different than a face-to-face interview. In a face-to-face interview, you cannot have a cheat sheet right below the camera to see what you're going to talk about next. On the other hand, on a face-to-face interview, it's more about the emotions. It's a lot easier to communicate those emotions. In a digital interview, I must gesticulate. If I don't gesticulate, there's no chances are there won't be that good of a connection here. So also, on the other hand, it's a lot more complicated to screen to see how the other side is reacting to whatever I'm saying. So in this context of of a behavioral interview, now you know where it comes from and what they're looking for. Now, how can you cheat your way? How can you hack your way through this interview? There are a couple of methods here. There are a couple of better known and lesser known methods. The best known method here is to use cheat sheets. In other words, you use the stories that you prepare going into a behavioral interview, and you put your stories on a wall behind the camera. You eventually put, the leadership principles and a couple of other, maybe most commonly asked questions behind the camera, and basically during the interview hope for the best, right? This is one method. Another method, a lesser known method, but which I previously talked about on my channel, is that any employer knows exactly what they're looking for in a job interview. And if they know, they obviously won't tell you most of the time. But if you make them spill the beans, and if you have 6 interviewers, then chances are, if you ask each of them what's that one thing or what's those 3 or 5 things that characterize the best candidates, chances are, you will significantly improve your chances to get the job this way. There are also other elements you want to keep in mind, but these are the main things, So on the other hand, on one hand is cheat sheets. The other one is, the thing with finding out what's really important for them. And of course, in the cheat sheets, there are various ramifications. You prepare the list with the most commonly asked questions, which, by the way, also in some cases work pretty well. I had some really good results with some people on those, but these are the main things. Now, before getting into how to actually use them and some mistakes and how these things work, is this something that you would want to explore at all? And this is a very interesting question, because I know at least 3 cases where people have failed their interviews, specifically with Amazon for pretty senior roles, because they were using cheat sheets, right? This being said, I know plenty of people who actually passed those Amazon interviews and were using, were cheating, essentially, were cheating their way through the interview. But let me give you a framework to help you to decide for yourself if this is something for you. So if you think about yourself, about you throughout your career and in school, have you been someone who likes to cheat your way through various things? Like people cheat in exams in school, for example. Have you been cheating in exams in school successfully, or is this something that you were really anxious about? If this is something that you were really anxious about, I would definitely suggest you to throw away all your cheat sheets and don't even think about cheating in a behavioral interview, because it won't fly. You will get stuck. On the other extreme, if you're someone who feels comfortable, and especially for more sales-like roles, where it's not all the time, but it could be also about cheating your way through various processes, that it's more likely to work. I also found that people with great educational backgrounds are less likely to be exceptional cheaters. I also found out that, at least in my experience, but this is a very biased statistic, because I coached, I speak to a lot more men than women. I found that men are more likely to cheat than women. Take it for what it is, but again, the main thing here is the main criteria for you to being a successful cheater, if you want, in a behavioral interview, is whether you are someone who's done this before. If you've never done this before, if you're anxious at all, or if you're easily getting anxious about these things, don't do it. It won't fly, right? Now, how do you cheat in these behavioral interviews? So the number, and I'm going to talk about this from the lens of making mistakes here, because I believe this is the most relevant thing to do. So the standard approach that many of you make is that you prepare for the interview, let's say for 2 weeks, right? You prepare your stories, you have your stories in the latest possible version, you have your stories on your cards, and you print your cards right behind your, I don't know, on a wall, right behind your camera, and then you go to use them in a job interview. The problem with that approach is you have too much information that you're going to be using for this interview, because you're going to have supposedly around 20 stories. So if you have 20 stories, that's a lot of information to scan through in a job interview. If you're comfortable doing this, yes, that's fine, but you should think of compressing that information. For example, the extreme compression I'm talking about here is to simply have a list with your stories, with your 20 stories. And if you do this list with your 20 stories and you find it sufficient for you to remember the story that you want to use in the job interview, well, guess what? You can use that list right here, during the interview, and simply ask your interviewer, hey, is it okay if I use this list with those 20 stories, just to ensure that I always use the best story? I've never heard of anyone refusing a candidate to use a list with, I don't know, basic stuff. I've never heard that, even for on-site interviews. So that would work, right? But the idea is that you must compress. If you use a whole panel with that much information, the chances that you're going to become overwhelmed significantly increase. Also here, something that you might want to consider is that if you spend 2 weeks on preparing your stories, you might spend, a little bit more time to prepare the cheat sheets in a more advanced format, as compared to if you were preparing your story for 3 days, right? So the more time you invest in preparing for an interview, the more time you should invest for the cheat sheets as well, right? So you must engineer this thing. Right, so that's what I'm saying. If you're the type of person who's done this before, you're more likely to succeed. So if you're the type of person who doesn't easily get anxious in job interviews, then yes, again, you're more likely to succeed, but you must engineer this thing. So long story short about these stories, either have them as a list and use them, be straightforward with them because they don't really care. Either, compress them, have the story on your card and with some main keynotes under each story what you would want to touch upon, and that's pretty much it. Of course, it's also a good idea that you have the company's core values or leadership principles and mission somewhere, because it's possible that they will ask you, but for example, in the case of Amazon, they will scan you based on those leadership principles. And this brings me to the next cheat in a behavioral interview. So if you will have 4 or 6 interviews, you will know that pretty much in any interview they will be screening you on 2 leadership principles, more or less. Now, if during the job interview you will take notes of the questions that you were asked, from those questions that you were asked, you will be able to extract the leadership principle that they were interested in screening you on, right? So if you do this 4 rounds in a row, that 4 times 2 is 8 leadership principles. So you'll only have to pick between the last round will only be on one of those 6 remaining ones, or probably even less, because they might also have asked you some of these principles in the second phone interview. So by taking notes, right, by elimination, you will find you are likely to know exactly what to expect. So this is another way to cheat, in a way that you will know what to expect, so you will always give significantly better answers. Another way you would want to cheat, you would want to keep the things, and this is again related with your cheat sheet. You would want to keep a list with what makes you a great candidate. What are those key elements, your core competencies that you are sure you want to over communicate in a job interview. You must also keep those somewhere nearby. And this is because you want to overemphasize on them. Because the more you focus on your strengths in a job interview, the more likely you will show as a strong candidate. And to give you a counterexample here, you might know that using a story multiple times in a job interview is a bad idea, because they will talk between each other and they will see, hey, this guy might not have enough experience. But in reality, the discussion is the following. If you're using the best story over and over again, you will show as an extraordinarily great candidate. But that's a hack, because you are overusing your best possible story. While in the same way, if you're overusing the same core competency and you know how to communicate it, you will be perceived as a strong candidate, and they cannot really complain about this, right? So this is another thing. You would want to keep your core competency that you would want to over communicate somewhere nearby for each and every interviewer to communicate with. Now, what else can you do to cheat your way through these interviews? Well, another method that, this is going to be a little bit to extremes. So some people, instead of using those cheat sheets on a wall behind their camera, most of the time you'll be talking on a webcam on a job interview, or at least you will have a monitor in front of you. Well, if you have a monitor in front of you, or 2 monitors in front of you if you want, you can put your stories on that monitor. And since your hands will, right now this is a very wide lens, so it's also 2 meters away from you, so that's why you see that much. But usually it's a close-up in a job interview, so they won't see what you do with your hands. So with your hands, you can easily browse through those stories if you want. And if you have if you are looking at the camera, you can at the same time look at the screen. And there are people who like to keep these things on their computer, to keep their stories on a computer. And if you want to take this even further, if your connection is not stable, if the resolution of the video is not great, well, guess what? There are people who are actually reading the answers from their monitor in a job interview. I know it might sound extreme, and I know it might sound like extreme cheating for a job interview, but there are people who actually do this, and I know people who actually got jobs for doing this. Now, the real question is what types of job they got. They got in senior sales roles, so they got in pretty significant roles, and those people had a extraordinarily impressive CV. Like, I was really blown away by the type of CV. And by the way, English, it wasn't their first language. To to give you one more reason to think about this. But the idea is that that person was that good that they knew exactly what they're going to say for each of those questions. Needless to say, they prepared for weeks before that specific interview. They wrote these answers in such a specific format that they could read them during a job interview. The internet connection was not good enough to have a high resolution video link, so this all, and their background in sales, so basically he's really good at speaking and he's really good at cheating their way through these processes, and this all together helped them to put together a great show during the interview and actually get the job. It sounded extremely sketchy for me at first, but hey, you know, there are people for whom all this works. I will re-emphasize one more time. If you're someone who easily gets anxious, or if you're someone, you know, who's never done this before, it's more likely that it will not work for you because you're not used to these things, and in the heat of the moment. And a behavioral interview is a very emotionally intensive experience. So, in my opinion, you should really A/B test before you go, or try to apply at various other companies before and see how you react, see how you perform with these things, especially if you have a lot of time to prepare for these job interviews. So this would be I talked about where does behavioral interviewing comes from, and again, this comes from investment banking, where, you know, people are supposed to be great speakers and great at convincing other people of these things. I talked about whether you should or you shouldn't consider cheating your way through a behavioral interview, keeping in mind that, you know, your employer is more likely not really going to care about these things, because they only care about building trust in that conversation. So long as you convince them of something. Well, if you had a cheat sheet and you inspired yourself during the conversation, so what? It doesn't really matter for them, but it might matter. It might be a game changer for you. And I also explain to you how do actually people cheat their way through in these jobs interviews. So hopefully you found at least some of this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.